In the heart of America's farmland, where wheat fields stretch endlessly under vast blue skies, a wedding was about to become the talk of 3 counties. The Somerset family had spared no expense for their only daughter Rachel's perfect day. The century-old Methodist church gleamed with white roses and silver ribbons, packed with 200 guests in their Sunday best. But when Pastor Mitchell asked Thomas McKinnon if he took Rachel to be his lawfully wedded wife, the words that escaped his lips weren't "I do." Instead, he turned pale, leaned close to Rachel's ear, and whispered 2 devastating words: "I don't." As shocked gasps rippled through the congregation, it was Thomas's younger brother James who stepped forward, his weathered hands steady, his voice clear with purpose. What happened next would challenge everything this close-knit farming community thought they knew about love, loyalty, and redemption. But the real question is, can a marriage born from scandal survive the whispers of those who claim to know better? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Rachel Somerset sat at her childhood kitchen table, surrounded by the familiar scent of her mother's coffee and fresh-baked cinnamon rolls. Her wedding planning journal lay open before her, its pages filled with careful notes, fabric swatches, and pressed flowers from Thomas's first bouquet. The morning sun filtered through gingham curtains that had hung in that window since before. She was born, casting warm squares of light across the well-worn tablecloth. "Everything's finally falling into place, Mama," Rachel said, running her finger down a meticulously crafted timeline. At 32, she'd waited longer than most in their farming community to marry, but she'd always believed some things were worth waiting for. Thomas McKinnon had been worth every minute of that wait. Martha Somerset smiled at her daughter from the sink, her hands busy with breakfast dishes. "The McKinnons are good people, sweetheart. You and Thomas, you've got a solid foundation." She dried her hands on her apron and joined Rachel at the table, picking up the journal to admire the latest additions. "Though I still say James did half the courting for his brother, always showing up with those fresh vegetables and helping your father with the equipment repairs." Rachel laughed, but there was a flutter of something uncertain in her stomach. It was true. James had been a constant presence throughout her relationship with Thomas. While Thomas attended agricultural business seminars and worked on expanding the McKinnon Farm's operations, James kept the day-to-day running smoothly. He was the one who remembered to bring soup when she had the flu, who noticed when the fence needed mending, who seemed to anticipate needs before they arose. "Thomas has big plans for both farms," Rachel said, pushing away the odd feeling. "Once we're married, combining the Somerset and McKinnon lands will give us nearly 2,000 acres. He's already talking about organic certification and specialty crops." She pulled out a carefully folded business plan from the back of her journal. Thomas had presented it to both families over Sunday dinner last month, complete with PowerPoint. Slides and profit projections. Martha's hands stilled on the journal's pages. "Sometimes I wonder if he forgets that farming isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. Your father and Joe McKinnon, they built these farms on handshakes and help when needed. All those fancy projections don't mean much when drought hits or prices bottom out. That's why it's good he has James," Rachel found herself saying. "James understands the old ways, but Thomas brings modern innovation. They balance each other out." Even as she spoke, she remembered the look that had passed between the brothers during Thomas's presentation, James's quiet resignation, Thomas's flash of irritation. The wedding preparations consumed the next several weeks. Rachel's journal grew thick with contracts and confirmations. The Methodist Church, which had hosted Somerset and McKinnon weddings for generations, was booked. Martha altered her own wedding dress for Rachel, letting out the waist and adding delicate beadwork to the vintage lace. The ladies of the church auxiliary organized a shower that filled the community center with casserole dishes and hand-embroidered linens. Through it all, Thomas remained focused on the future of their combined farms. His enthusiasm for modernization and expansion was infectious, even if it sometimes felt at odds with the community's slower, more traditional pace. "We'll show them all what real progressive farming looks like," he'd say, spreading maps across Rachel's kitchen table. "No more getting by on gentlemen's agreements and outdated methods." It was James who noticed Rachel's occasional unease. One evening, as she stayed late at the McKinnon farm reviewing wedding details, he found her staring at the sunset from the front porch. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, settling into the rocking chair beside her with 2 glasses of sweet tea. "Just thinking about change," she said, accepting the tea gratefully. "Sometimes it feels like everything's moving so fast. Thomas has such big dreams." James was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his glass. "Dreams are good," he said finally, "but so are roots. The best farming takes both, vision for tomorrow and respect for what came before." Rachel looked at him then, really looked at him. In the golden evening light, she could see the resemblance to Thomas. They shared the same strong McKinnon jaw, the same tall frame. But where Thomas burned with restless energy, James had an ease about him, a steadiness that reminded her of the deep-rooted oaks that lined their property. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't quite sure what. She was thanking him for the tea, perhaps, or maybe just for being there, solid and reassuring, while her world spun with change. The week before the wedding arrived with a flurry of final details. Rachel's journal was now a command center of post-it notes and checklists. The dress hung, ready in her childhood bedroom. Thomas was increasingly absorbed in meetings with agricultural consultants, leaving James to help with last-minute preparations. "He's just excited about the future," Rachel told herself as she watched James hang. Wreaths on the church doors. But something in her chest tightened when she realized it was James, not Thomas, who had remembered her favorite flowers for the bouquets. James, who knew she preferred peonies to roses, who had quietly made sure they were ordered despite the extra expense. The night before the wedding, Rachel sat alone in her room, her journal open to a blank page. She meant to write something meaningful, her hopes, her dreams, her love for Thomas. Instead, she found herself remembering quiet moments, James's steady presence, his thoughtful gestures, the way he listened when she spoke about keeping some things traditional. She closed the journal without writing a word, telling herself the flutter in her stomach was just normal wedding nerves. Tomorrow would be perfect. Everything was planned, every detail accounted for. She had the right man, the right dress, the right future ahead of her. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, she wondered about steady hands and understanding smiles, well, that was just pre-wedding jitters, nothing more. The old John Deere tractor sat in the McKinnon barn like a family patriarch, its green paint worn to a patina by decades of faithful service. James ran his hand along its hood as he had every morning for the past 20 years, a gesture as much ritual as inspection. The machine had been his grandfather's, then his father's, and now served as a testament to the McKinnon way of farming, steady, reliable, and built to last. Thomas had been pushing to sell it, arguing that newer models would increase efficiency. "That thing's a museum piece, James," he'd say, brandishing glossy equipment catalogues. "We can't compete in today's market with yesterday's tools." But James knew what Thomas couldn't seem to understand, that some tools carried more than their mechanical worth. This tractor had pulled their father's stuck pickup from spring mud, had hauled hay bales through summer storms, had been the first piece of equipment both brothers had learned to drive. Their father, Joe McKinnon, had taught them right here in this barn, his patience as steady as the old engine's rhythm. "Keep your hand on the throttle gentle like," Joe would say. "Machine's got its own wisdom. You just need to learn to listen." James had taken those words to heart, applying them not just to farming, but to life itself. Thomas, 3 years older, and already dreaming of bigger things, had simply rolled his eyes. The brothers' different approaches to farming had emerged early. Where James saw the poetry in straight furrows and the satisfaction of manual labor, Thomas saw inefficiencies to be corrected. He'd gone off to agricultural college while James stayed home, learning the land's language through his hands and his father's quiet guidance. "Your brother's got big ideas," Joe had told James one evening, as they watched Thomas's truck disappear down the drive toward another business meeting. "Nothing wrong with that, but ideas don't grow crops. Soil does, and soil needs tending, not just planning." James understood both sides of it. The farm needed to adapt to survive. Thomas wasn't wrong about that, but it needed to hold on to its heart too. The generations of knowledge worked into every acre. He'd tried to be the bridge between old and new, supporting Thomas's innovations while preserving their father's methods. The morning sun was climbing higher, and James could hear Thomas's voice drifting from the office, another conference call about organic certification requirements. He started the tractor, its familiar rumble a counterpoint to his thoughts. There was work to be done, regardless of tomorrow's changes. As he drove toward the back 40, he passed Rachel's car pulling up to the house. She'd been spending more time here lately, reviewing wedding plans and farm merger details with Thomas. James lifted his hand in greeting, noticed her wave back, tried not to think about the way sunrise caught in her hair or how her smile seemed to carry a hint of something uncertain. Thomas had announced their engagement at last year's harvest. Dinner, standing up before both families with his characteristic confidence. "Rachel and I are going to revolutionize farming in this county," he declared, raising his glass. "The Somerset-McKinnon Agricultural Partnership will set new standards for sustainable, profitable agriculture." James remembered watching Rachel's face in that moment, the slight flutter of her fingers against her water glass, the barely perceptible shift in her smile. He'd recognized something in her expression, a shadow of the same feeling he carried, the sense that Thomas's grand vision somehow missed the simple beauty of what they already had. But Thomas was his brother, and Rachel was Thomas's choice. James had pushed down whatever feelings might have stirred during the quiet moments they'd shared. Her laughter when he'd taught her to drive the old tractor, their long talks about preserving traditional farming methods, the comfortable silences as they worked side by side in the garden. The tractor crested a small rise, and James could see clear across both properties, the Somerset fields merging seamlessly with McKinnon land. The view had always moved him, but lately it carried a bittersweet edge. Tomorrow it would all be officially joined under Thomas's management style. The old ways would gradually give way to new methods, computer models replacing almanac wisdom. "You're awful quiet lately," his mother had said last Sunday, finding him alone in the equipment shed. Wedding jitters by proxy? He'd managed a smile. Just thinking about changes coming, she'd studied him with knowing eyes. Some changes looked like endings at first, turn out to be beginnings instead. Before he could respond, she'd patted his arm and added, "Just remember what your father always says. The land knows what it needs. People do too, if they listen." Close enough. Now, guiding the tractor along the field's edge, James wondered if anyone else noticed how Rachel's eyes lingered on the old ways. The antique quilts his mother preserved, the hand-drawn maps his father still used, the weather-worn fence posts that told stories of generations. She seemed to understand, as he did, that progress didn't have to mean erasure, but tomorrow she would marry Thomas, and James would stand beside them as best man, doing what he'd always done, supporting his brother's vision while quietly preserving what he could of their heritage. The old tractor would stay as long as he had any say, a reminder that not all value could be calculated in spreadsheets and profit margins. The sun climbed higher as James worked, each pass across the field a meditation. On past and future, loyalty and longing, duty and desire. By noon, when he saw Rachel's car leaving the farm, he had resigned himself again to his role in the story. The steady brother, the keeper of traditions, the one who would stand witness tomorrow as the woman who understood his heart promised. Herself to the brother who held her hand. The wedding program lay on the antique dresser in the church's bridal room, its cream-colored paper embossed with silver script. Rachel traced her fingers over the names. Thomas Joseph McKinnon and Rachel Ann Somerset request the honor of your presence. Her eyes drifted to the list of participants, lingering on James William McKinnon, best man. Everything looked perfect, exactly as she'd planned. So why did her hands tremble slightly as she set the program down? The morning had dawned clear and cool, a perfect September Saturday. Martha Somerset had woken her daughter with coffee and fresh scones, just as her own mother had done on her wedding day. The familiar routine of preparation had followed. Hair, makeup, the careful donning of the altered vintage dress, the positioning of her grandmother's pearl clips in her hair. "You look just like my mama," Martha had whispered, adjusting the veil. She'd be so proud today. Rachel had smiled at her reflection, trying to focus on the joy of tradition rather than the flutter of uncertainty in her stomach. Across town at the McKinnon farm, the brothers moved through their own preparations. James knocked on Thomas's door, coffee in hand. "Rise and shine, future groom." The words felt strange in his mouth, heavy with unspoken weight. Thomas was already dressed, standing at his window overlooking the fields. "I was just reviewing the latest commodity futures," he said, gesturing to his laptop. "We'll need to make some quick decisions after the honeymoon about crop rotation." James set the coffee down harder than necessary. "It's your wedding day. Thomas, the futures can wait. Everything's connected, little brother. This merger, this marriage, it's all part of building something bigger." Thomas straightened his tie, his movements precise and controlled. "Rachel understands that. She's practical, like me." But James remembered Rachel's face when she'd found the old family photos in their attic, her delight in the stories behind each faded image. She wasn't just practical. She was romantic, sentimental, deeply connected to the history of their community. The thought sent an uncomfortable pang through his chest. The church filled steadily through the morning. 200 guests, representing the intertwined histories of both families and the broader farming community, settled into worn wooden pews. The printed programs passed from hand to hand, a roadmap for the ceremony that everyone assumed would proceed exactly as planned. In the pastor's study, Thomas paced, checking his phone periodically for updates from the commodities market. James watched him, a growing unease settling in his gut. "Thomas," he said finally, "are you happy?" Thomas paused. "Happy? Of course. This is the culmination of years of planning. With the Somerset land combined with ours, we'll have the economy of scale to implement real changes. Drone farming, precision agriculture, vertical integration. That's not what I asked." James stepped closer to his brother. "Are you happy about marrying Rachel?" For a moment, something flickered across Thomas's face. Doubt, fear, resignation. But then his features smoothed back into their usual confident mask. "Everything's proceeding according to plan," he said, turning back to his phone. Meanwhile, in the bridal room, Rachel stood before another mirror, her mother and bridesmaids making final adjustments to her dress. Through the window, she could see guests arriving, their Sunday best brightened by early autumn sunshine. Her wedding journal lay open on a nearby table, its pages containing every detail of this moment, except for the growing tension in her chest. 5 minutes, the church coordinator announced, popping her head in the door. Rachel's bridesmaids gathered their bouquets, pale pink peonies with sprigs of baby's breath. Martha hugged her daughter carefully, mindful of the dress. "Ready, sweetheart?" Rachel nodded, unable to find words. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? The merger of two historic farms, a secure future, a sensible partnership. Then why did every step toward the sanctuary door feel like she was walking through deep water? The organist began the prelude, Bach's air on the G string floating through the church. James took his place beside Thomas at the altar, watching the back doors for the procession to begin. He could see his brother's jaw clenched tight, his hands clasped perhaps a bit too firmly behind his back. The bridesmaids processed one by one, a parade of pink dresses and nervous smiles. Then the wedding march began, and the congregation rose as one. Rachel appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, a vision in vintage lace and subtle sparkle. James felt his breath catch, not just at her beauty, but at the mixture of emotions playing across her face. Hope, fear, determination, and something else he couldn't quite name. She moved down the aisle with measured steps, each one bringing her closer to what everyone believed was her perfect future. Thomas stood rigid beside James, his expression unreadable. The pastor began the ceremony, his familiar voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." James watched as Rachel and Thomas joined hands. Her fingers trembled slightly. Thomas's remained stiff and cool. The pastor moved through the familiar liturgy, speaking of love and commitment, honor and trust. James found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't have said why. Then came the moment. "Do you, Thomas Joseph McKinnon, take Rachel Ann Somerset to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Time seemed to stop. James saw his brother's face go pale, saw the slight shake of his head as if trying to clear it. Then Thomas leaned close to Rachel's ear, his voice a whisper that somehow carried in the expectant silence. "I don't." The congregation's collective gasp seemed to pull all the air from the room. Rachel swayed slightly, her bouquet dropping to the altar steps. James moved without thinking, steadying her with a gentle hand at her elbow. Their eyes met for a brief, electric moment. Shock, pain, and something else passing between them. Thomas stepped back, his voice stronger now. "I'm sorry, I can't. The merger, the plans, they're not enough. You deserve—" He stopped, looking lost for the first time James could remember. "You deserve someone who loves you for more than your land." The sanctuary erupted in murmurs and movement. Rachel's father half rose from his pew, face darkening. Martha Somerset pressed a hand to her mouth, and through it all Rachel and James remained connected by that light touch at her elbow, both of them somehow knowing that what happened next would change everything. James's worn Bible sat heavy in his suit pocket, its leather soft from years of daily reading. His father had given it to him on his 16th birthday, the same day he'd first driven the tractor alone. "Good judgment comes from experience," Joe had said, "and experience comes from bad judgment. This book helps with both." Now, standing beside Rachel at the altar, while his brother's footsteps echoed down the side aisle, James felt the Bible's weight like an anchor. The congregation's whispers rose around them, like wind through wheat, and Rachel's hand trembled where it still rested in the crook of his elbow. "Rachel," he said softly, turning to face her. Her eyes met his, tears threatening but held back by what he recognized as pure Somerset determination. In that moment, everything crystallized. All the quiet conversations they'd shared, the understanding that had grown between them, the way they'd moved in comfortable synchronicity around each other's spaces. "I know this isn't the right time," he continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "and I know this isn't how anyone imagined this day would go. But I think maybe—" He paused, drawing strength from the familiar press of his Bible against his chest. "Maybe this is God's way of setting things right." Pastor Mitchell stepped forward, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "James, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes the right path isn't the planned one." James took both of Rachel's hands in his, noting how naturally they fit together. "Rachel, you and I, we see the world the same way. We understand that farming isn't just about profits and projections. It's about heritage and hard work, and having someone beside you who shares your soul's language." A murmur rippled through the church. Martha Somerset half rose from her pew, then slowly sat back down, her hand finding her husband's. Joe McKinnon leaned forward, his weathered face intent. "James William McKinnon," Rachel whispered, her voice catching. "Are you proposing to me?" "At my own wedding? I suppose I am." He managed a small smile. "Though in my defense, it wasn't exactly a planned event." Something shifted in Rachel's eyes, fear giving way to consideration, shock softening into possibility. "We can't just—" "Why not?" James reached into his pocket and withdrew his Bible. "Everything we need is right here. The pastor, our families, even the flowers you love." He glanced at the scattered peonies, then back to her face. "All that's missing is your answer." Pastor Mitchell cleared his throat. "This is unusual, to say the least. Rachel, child, no one would blame you if you wanted to take some time, think things through." But Rachel was looking at James with growing certainty. "All I've done for the past year is think," she said, "about the future, about what makes a good partnership, about what really matters in building a life together." Her fingers tightened around James's. "And the truth is, every time I imagined that future, you were there, not just as Thomas's brother, but as the person who understood, who saw me." James felt his heart expand in his chest. "Is that a yes?" "It's crazy," she said, a smile breaking through her tears. "But yes, yes." The sanctuary erupted in a chaos of voices, shocked exclamations, hurried consultations, a few scattered laughs of disbelief. James's mother had pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes bright with what looked suspiciously like approval. Joe McKinnon stood slowly, commanding attention without a word. "Pastor," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the noise, "I believe you still have a wedding to perform, if you're willing." Pastor Mitchell looked between James and Rachel, then at their joined hands. He'd known both families for decades, had baptized both siblings, had watched these young people grow up in his congregation. After a long moment, he nodded. "The Lord does work in mysterious ways," he said, opening his Bible to the marriage service. "And sometimes, just sometimes, he knows better than our best-laid plans." James turned to face Rachel fully, his hands steady now as they held hers. The morning light through the stained glass windows painted her in soft colors, and he thought she had never looked more beautiful than in this moment of pure truth. "I should warn you," he said softly as the pastor began to speak, "I come with an old tractor that I refuse to sell." Rachel's laugh was watery but real. "I should warn you, I come with a wedding journal full of plans that just went out the window. We'll write new ones," he promised. "Together." The ceremony that followed was shorter than the original plan, but somehow more profound. When Pastor Mitchell asked James if he took Rachel to be his wife, his "I do" rang with quiet certainty. And when Rachel spoke her own vows, her voice was clear and sure, all traces of her earlier tension gone. As they turned to face their families, now as husband and wife, James felt the weight of his Bible in his pocket and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. Sometimes he realized the best decisions were the ones you didn't plan, the ones that came straight from the heart, guided by faith and the courage to recognize when life offered a better path than the one you'd mapped out. The chaos would come later. Explanations to be made, arrangements to be adjusted, a brother to be reconciled with. But for now, with Rachel's hand warm in his and their families rising to surround them with stunned but growing acceptance, James knew that sometimes the greatest acts of loyalty were the ones that seemed at first glance like betrayal. Sometimes love required the courage to break one promise in order to keep a deeper one, the promise to be true to your own heart and to recognize real love when God placed it unexpectedly in your path. The hotel room keycard felt unusually heavy in James's hand as they stood in the elevator, both still in their wedding clothes, the events of the day settling around them like dust after a storm. The Grand Prairie Hotel wasn't the honeymoon suite in Kansas City that Thomas had booked, but it was the best their small town had to offer. And the desk clerk had been kind enough not to mention that she'd just checked in the wrong McKinnon. Brother, I can sleep on the couch," James offered as they reached their floor, the overhead lights humming softly in the silence between them. "Or I can get another room entirely. Whatever makes you comfortable." Rachel's laugh held a touch of hysteria. "Comfortable? I just married my almost brother-in-law in front of 200 people. I'm not sure comfortable is in today's vocabulary." They reached their door, and James fumbled with the keycard, hyper-aware of Rachel's presence beside him. The green light blinked, and they stepped into the room together, then stopped, taking in the rose petals scattered across the bed, clearly the hotel's standard romantic package, arranged when Thomas had made the reservation. "Oh, good Lord," Rachel murmured, then began to laugh in earnest. James joined her, the absurdity of the situation finally breaking through their careful politeness. They stood in the doorway, still in their wedding finery, laughing until tears came to their eyes. "I'll clean those up," James said when he could speak again, moving toward the bed. "And maybe we should order some food. I don't think either of us ate anything at the reception." The reception, if you could call it that, had been a blur of shocked faces and hushed conversations. Their mothers had rallied admirably, directing the catering staff to serve the meal as planned, while their fathers had retreated to the church office with glasses of bourbon to sort things out. Thomas hadn't returned, though James's phone showed 3 missed calls from his brother. Food would be good, Rachel agreed, slipping off her heels with a sigh of relief. She perched on the room's armchair, gathering her skirts around her. "Though I suppose we should talk first." James sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Where would you like to start?" "I honestly don't know." Rachel reached up and began removing the pearl clips from her hair, setting them carefully on the side table. "Maybe with why you did it. Really did it, I mean, not just the nice words you said in church." James was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Do you remember last harvest, when that storm was coming in? Everyone was rushing to get the wheat in, and you showed up at our place with sandwiches and coffee." Rachel nodded, her hands stilling in her hair. "You didn't just drop them off. You stayed, helped us cover the equipment, knew exactly where everything needed to go. Then you sat with me in the cab of the combine for 6 hours straight, running those last fields in the dark." He smiled at the memory. "You didn't talk about profit margins or market futures. You talked about how you could smell the rain coming, how your grandfather used to say you could hear wheat whisper when it was ready for harvest." "I remember," she said softly. "That's when I knew I was in trouble." James met her eyes, because every time after that, every conversation we had about the land, about tradition, about what really matters, it felt like coming home. "But you were Thomas's, so I pushed it down, tried to be the good brother, the supportive brother. Until today." "Until today." He spread his hands. "I know it's not simple. I know there will be talk, complications with the farms, family dynamics to navigate. But when you were standing there at the altar and Thomas—" He trailed off, not wanting to push too far. Rachel stood, moving to the window that overlooked their small town's main street. "I kept a list," she said after a moment, "in my wedding journal. 2 columns, head and heart. The head column was all about Thomas, the business plan, the farm merger, the practical benefits. It made perfect sense." She turned back to face him. "But the heart column, I couldn't fill it out. I tried, but the words wouldn't come. And now," James asked quietly, "now I think maybe I was writing in the wrong column all along." She smiled, though her eyes were damp. "Because my heart knew things my head wasn't ready to admit. Like how it felt when you'd bring me coffee just the way I like it, or how natural it was working beside you, or how you're the first person I want to tell when something good happens." James stood slowly, moving to join her at the window. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," he said. "We can take this as slow as you need." Rachel reached for his hand, twining their fingers together. "I think we've both been taking it slow for long enough, don't you?" A knock at the door interrupted whatever James might have said next. They turned to find a room service cart being delivered. Soup, sandwiches, and a bottle of wine they hadn't ordered. "Compliments of your mother's," the server said with a knowing smile. "Mrs. McKinnon said to tell you that sometimes the best blessings come disguised as disasters, and Mrs. Somerset added that there's nothing good food can't help sort out." After the server left, they sat together on the small sofa, shoes off, wedding clothes wrinkled, sharing soup and quiet conversation. The awkwardness gradually faded into something more comfortable, more true to who they'd always been together. "Thomas will come around," Rachel said eventually, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "He's practical, if nothing else. He'll see this makes more sense." "Maybe," James agreed. "But right now, I'm more concerned about you. Are you okay?" "Really?" "Okay?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment, stirring her soup thoughtfully. "I think I'm more okay than I have been in months. Is that terrible to say?" "No," James said simply. "It's honest. And that's what we promised each other today. Honesty. Above all else." They talked late into the night, making plans, sharing fears, occasionally breaking into fresh laughter at the sheer improbability of their situation. When exhaustion finally caught up with them, James insisted on taking the couch, and Rachel didn't argue too hard. They both understood that some things needed time to unfold naturally. As Rachel drifted off to sleep in the rose-petal-free bed, she heard James's quiet voice from the darkness of the sitting area. "I meant what I said, you know, about writing new plans together." "I know," she murmured back. "And James, I'm glad it was you. I think maybe it was always supposed to be you." The hotel keycard lay on the bedside table, catching the soft light from the window. No longer just a piece of plastic, but a symbol of their first night as husband and wife, the beginning of a story neither of them had planned, but both of them, somehow, had been writing all along. The local newspaper lay unopened on their breakfast table at Rosemary's Diner, its bold headline impossible to ignore. "Wedding shock. Brother swaps at Somerset McKinnon's ceremony." Sarah, their usual waitress, had placed it face down when she brought their coffee, her sympathy evident in the extra side of bacon she'd added to their order. "Well," Rachel said, finally flipping the paper over, "at least they used a nice photo." The picture showed them leaving the church, her hand tucked into James's elbow, both their faces bearing expressions of stunned determination. The article beneath was mercifully brief, though the phrase "unprecedented altar exchange" made James wince. "Mother called this morning," he said, adding a third sugar to his coffee, something he only did when stressed. "Thomas stayed at their place last night. He's already talking to lawyers about the farm merger agreements." Rachel nodded, her face composed, though her fingers worried at her napkin. "Dad mentioned the same thing. He said—" She paused, managing a small smile. "He said to tell you that good fences make good neighbors, but good hearts make better families. I think that's his way of saying he's coming around." The bell above the diner's door chimed, and they both looked up to see Betty Anderson, who ran the feed store, pause in the doorway. Her eyes widened at the sight of them, and she quickly ducked back out, no doubt headed straight to the coffee group that met every Sunday morning at the Methodist church basement. "That's the third person who's done that," James observed, reaching across the table to still Rachel's fidgeting hands. "We can go somewhere else if you'd prefer." "No," Rachel said firmly, turning her hand to grip his. "We have nothing to be ashamed of. Besides, they'll have to get used to seeing us together eventually." As if to prove her point, she raised their joined hands and pressed a kiss to his knuckles, just as Reverend Mitchell's wife walked past their window. The older woman's eyebrows shot up, but then, surprisingly, she smiled and gave them a small wave. "Did you see Thomas's truck at the farm when you went to change clothes this morning?" Rachel asked, returning to her breakfast. "No," James replied, "but he left a message. Said he's taking some time to evaluate his options." "Whatever that means." "It means he's hurt," Rachel said softly, "and angry." and probably feeling betrayed by both of us. Are you having regrets? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Rachel looked at their joined hands, then up at James's face. The face she'd known for years, but was now learning in a new way, seeing the subtle signs of worry in the corners of his eyes. My only regret, she said carefully, is that we didn't figure this out sooner, before things got so complicated. James's shoulders relaxed slightly. We'll weather this, he said, his voice low and certain. Together. The diner's door chimed again, and this time it was Martha Somerset who entered, carrying a covered dish and wearing her determined Sunday expression. She made her way directly to their table, set down her burden, and put her hands on her hips. Well, she said, looking between them, I suppose you two have given everyone something to talk about for the next decade or so. Then her face softened. I brought you some cinnamon rolls, the good ones with the extra icing. Heaven knows you'll need the energy to deal with all this. She slid into the booth beside Rachel, helping herself to James's unused coffee cup. Now, then let's talk about damage control. Joe McKinnon's already spoken to the bank about restructuring the merger paperwork. And I've called Betty Anderson to tell her if she doesn't stop spreading wild stories about you two having some kind of secret affair, she can find somewhere else to sell her gossip along with her feed. Rachel leaned against her mother's shoulder, relief evident in her posture. Thanks, Mama. Don't thank me yet, Martha warned, but her eyes were kind. There's still plenty of rough road ahead, but she looked at James, really looked at him. I think maybe you've got the right co-pilot for the journey. The newspaper continued to announce their scandal to the diner's growing breakfast crowd, but somehow its headlines seemed less important. Now, they had each other, they had family in their corner, and they had Martha Somerset's cinnamon rolls, which, as any local could tell you, had been known to heal all manner of social wounds in their little community. The farm account books, spread across the kitchen table, told their own story of transition. Rachel sat with her reading glasses perched on her nose, comparing the Somerset and McKinnon records, while James made notes in the margins. 2 weeks into their unexpected marriage, they were slowly finding their way toward a new normal. Your father's accounting system is almost identical to mine, Rachel observed, tapping her pen against a column of neat figures. Thomas always said we needed to modernize, but there's something reassuring about seeing the years laid out like this, in your dad's handwriting. James smiled, sliding a fresh cup of coffee toward her. Dad always said you can read the history of a farm in its books, not just the numbers, but the stories behind them. See here? He pointed to a notation from 3 years back. That's when we lost the south field to flooding. But look at the next page. Highest yield we've ever had in the north section. The land has a way of balancing things out. They worked in comfortable silence, shoulders touching as they leaned over the books together. The morning sun streamed. Through windows Rachel had washed yesterday, while James had fixed the squeaky cabinet hinge that had bothered her for months. Small things, domestic things, but each one feeling like another stitch securing their new life together. I've been thinking, Rachel said, closing one ledger and opening another. Maybe we don't need to completely merge the operations right away. What if we kept the farms technically separate but coordinated our planning? That way, if Thomas decides to... She trailed off, still careful about mentioning his name. It makes sense, James agreed, understanding what she couldn't quite say. We can work together without legally combining everything, though we'll need to figure out the equipment sharing. We can start with your old tractor, Rachel teased, and was rewarded with James's laugh, a sound she was hearing more frequently these days. The screen door creaked and Joe McKinnon's voice called out, "Anybody home?" In the kitchen, "Dad," James answered, not moving away from Rachel. They'd decided early on not to hide their growing comfort with each other, even if it made others uncomfortable. Joe entered, carrying a basket of Martha Somerset's tomatoes. "Your mother sent these over," he told Rachel. "Said something about you knowing what to do with them." He set the basket down and looked at the spread of books. "Doing some planning. Trying to figure out how to move forward," Rachel said. "Would you like some coffee?" Don't mind if I do. Joe settled into a kitchen chair, accepting the cup Rachel poured him. You know, your brother's back, he said to James. Saw his truck at the house this morning. James tensed slightly, but Rachel's hand found his under the table. How did he seem? She asked. Quiet. Different. Joe took a thoughtful sip of coffee. Sometimes a man needs to step away to see things clearly. Your mother's invited everyone for Sunday dinner. Says it's time we all sat down together like adults. Rachel and James exchanged glances. All of us? James asked. All of us, Joe confirmed. Martha Somerset's making her chicken and dumplings, and your mother's doing that chocolate cake Thomas always loved. Figure if we're gonna heal this rift, might as well do it with good food on the table. He stood, reaching for his hat. Oh, and Rachel? That suggestion you made about the irrigation schedule? It's working better than the old way. Sometimes fresh eyes see what needs changing. He paused at the door. And sometimes they see what needs staying the same. After he left, Rachel leaned, her head against James's shoulder. Sunday dinner, she murmured. Are we ready for that? James pressed a kiss to her hair, still marveling that he could do so freely now. Ready or not, family is family. Besides, he added, your mother's chicken and dumplings could probably broker world peace. Rachel laughed, turning back to their account books. Together, they continued their planning, their notes filling the margins with a new shared vision, one that honored the past while making room for their future. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through late-season corn, and somewhere in the distance, a tractor engine hummed its steady song of work and home and hope. The unopened letter from Thomas sat between them on the McKinnon's dining room table, his precise handwriting stark against the cream envelope. Sunday dinner would start in less than an hour, and Rachel watched James stare at his brother's familiar script, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the tablecloth their mother had ironed specially for the occasion. We should read it before everyone arrives, Rachel said softly, reaching for the envelope. The paper was expensive, the kind Thomas always preferred for business correspondence. She broke the seal carefully, aware of the weight of James's gaze. Dear James and Rachel, she read aloud, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. I've spent these past weeks trying to understand what happened at the church. My first instinct was anger, at both of you, at myself, at the situation. But time has a way of clearing one's vision. I realize now that I was building a business partnership, not a marriage. My plans for the farms were sound from a financial perspective, but they left no room for the human element. Rachel, you tried to tell me this in your way, talking about traditions and community connections. I wasn't listening, or perhaps I was listening for profit margins when I should have been hearing heart. James, you've always understood what I couldn't, that farming isn't just about efficiency and innovation. It's about stewardship, about maintaining the connections between land and people that our parents and grandparents built. I was so focused on the future that I forgot to honor the past. I can't say I'm happy about how things happened. The scandal has complicated our business relationships in ways that will take time to resolve. But watching you two work together, these past weeks, yes, I've driven by the farms. Though I kept my distance, I've seen something I never achieved with either of you. Genuine partnership. Mother invited me to dinner tonight. I'll come, not to cause trouble, but because she's right. We're still family, however complicated that may now be. I've brought contracts releasing both farms from the merger agreements. We can discuss future cooperation when wounds are less fresh. Your brother and former fiancé, Thomas, Rachel set the letter down, watching James's face as he processed his brother's words. Well, she said finally, that's more understanding than I expected. Thomas was always practical, James replied, his voice rough with emotion. Once he works through a problem, he finds the logical path forward. He reached for Rachel's hand. Are you okay? I think so. She squeezed his fingers. It helps that he saw us working together, that he understands this isn't just some impulsive decision that's falling apart. The sound of car doors closing outside made them both look up. Through the window, they could see Thomas getting out of his truck, a folder tucked under his arm and a covered dish balanced in his hands. Their mother hurried down the porch steps to greet him, and even from this distance they could see the careful way he accepted her hug. "Ready?" James asked, standing, and offering Rachel his arm, a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks. "Together," she answered, and they walked out to face whatever the evening might bring. The initial moments were awkward. Thomas's handshake a bit too firm, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. But Martha McKinnon had arranged the seating with diplomatic precision. Thomas between their parents, Rachel and James across from them, with the Somersets anchoring each end of the table. The familiar rhythm of passing dishes and complimenting the food gradually eased the tension. "The winter wheat's coming up strong," Joe McKinnon observed, carefully neutral. "Both properties showing good growth, I noticed," Thomas said, surprising everyone. "Drove by the back 40 yesterday. You're still using Dad's planting schedule, James?" "With some adjustments," Rachel suggested, James replied. She remembered some notes in her grandfather's almanac about soil rotation that made sense. Something flickered across Thomas's face, recognition perhaps of exactly why Rachel and James worked so well together. He nodded slowly. "I've been talking with a farming cooperative in the next county," he said. "They're interested in some of the modernization plans I developed. Might be a better fit there." "You're leaving?" James asked, and Rachel heard the complex mix of emotions in his voice. "Not far, still family." Thomas met their eyes for the first time. "Just need some space to build something of my own, something new." Rachel felt James relax slightly beside her. This was Thomas's way of giving blessing, not warm perhaps, but practical, accepting. The conversation turned to other topics. Martha's church committee, the weather forecast, Rachel's mother's plans for the flower beds. Not quite comfortable, but civil, healing. Later, as they watched Thomas's truck disappear down the drive, Rachel leaned into James's embrace. "Well," she said, "we survived." "More than survived," James replied. "We're going to be okay. All of us." The letter lay on the whole table, its message of qualified acceptance, a first step toward their new normal. Outside, the evening sun painted the fields in shades of gold, and somewhere in the distance, a lone killdeer called its piercing song of change and continuation. The first shared harvest photo hung proudly in the McKinnon kitchen, catching morning light that made the gold of the wheat fields glow. In it, Rachel and James stood beside the old John Deere, covered in dust and grinning like teenagers, though the exhaustion of a 20-hour workday showed in their eyes. Martha had insisted on taking it, saying every harvest needed documenting, especially this one. "I still can't believe we got it all in before the rain," Rachel said, handing James his coffee as they studied the photo. The storm had blown in just hours after they'd finished, bringing the kind of downpour that could have ruined weeks of work. "We make a good team," James replied, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Though I'm pretty sure you broke some kind of record with that last field. Never seen anyone run a combine that fast in the dark," Rachel laughed. "I had motivation. Besides, I learned from the best." She didn't have to explain that she meant his father. They both knew Joe McKinnon was legendary for his harvest-time efficiency. The kitchen phone rang, and Rachel answered it, her free hand automatically finding James's. "Somerset McKinnon? Residence?" she said, the new greeting still feeling fresh on her tongue. "Rachel, it's Ellen from the grain elevator." The operator's voice crackled with excitement. "Just wanted you to know your wheat tested at premium grade. Both farms. Best protein content we've seen all season." After she hung up, Rachel turned to James with shining eyes. "Premium grade," she said. "All of it. Your father's rotation schedule combined with my grandfather's soil amendments." She stopped, emotion catching in her throat. James pulled her close, understanding exactly what this meant. Their first harvest together hadn't just been successful. It had proven that their partnership worked, that combining their family's farming wisdom created something greater than either tradition alone. "We should celebrate," he said, pressing. "A kiss to her temple. Maybe drive into the city, have dinner at that nice place you like." Rachel shook her head, smiling. "I have a better idea." That evening found them in their favorite field, the one where the Somerset and McKinnon properties met. They'd spread an old quilt on the truck bed, sharing a thermos of coffee and Martha's apple pie as they watched the sunset paint the stubbled wheat fields in shades of amber and rose. "I used to come here sometimes," Rachel admitted, leaning back against James's chest. "Before, when Thomas was talking about his big plans and everything felt like it was moving too fast. Something about this spot always helped me think clearly." James tightened his arms around her. "I know. I saw you here once, about a month before the wedding. You were just standing, watching the wheat move in the wind. I wanted so badly to join you, but you were being the good brother, Rachel, finished, and I was being the practical fiancé." She turned in his embrace to face him. "How did we ever think we could build a life on what we were supposed to want instead of what we actually needed?" "Fear, maybe," James suggested. "Fear of changing things, of disappointing people, fear of admitting what was right in front of us." Rachel traced her fingers along his jaw, feeling the day's stubble. "I'm not afraid anymore." The kiss that followed was unhurried, deep with understanding and shared joy. When they finally parted, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Look," James said softly, pointing to the eastern horizon. "Harvest moon's rising." The huge orange disk seemed to float up from the earth itself, casting long shadows across their fields. In its light, the landscape transformed, familiar yet magical, like a story they'd always known suddenly revealing new meanings. "My grandmother used to say, 'The harvest moon shows us what we've earned through our hard work,'" Rachel said. "Not just the crops, but the relationships we've tended, the faith we've kept." James smiled. "Smart woman, your grandmother." Speaking of family wisdom, he reached into the truck's cab and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. "Dad gave me this today, said it was time." Rachel unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather-bound book, the original McKinnon Farm Journal started by James's great-grandfather. Inside, generations of farmers had recorded not just weather patterns and crop yields, but family histories, hopes, and lessons learned. "He said we should add our own chapter," James explained. "Our own way of doing things." Rachel ran her fingers over the well-worn cover, feeling the weight of history and possibility. "We'll write it together," she said, "starting with this harvest." Above them, the harvest moon continued its stately rise, blessing their fields, their partnership, their love born of shared earth and honest work. In its light, they began planning their next season, their voices mixing with the evening cricket's song, a harmony of old wisdom and new dreams, as natural as the turning of the earth beneath their feet. The family Christmas ornament glinted. In the firelight, its hand-painted surface showing 3 generations of McKinnons in front of the farmhouse. Rachel held it carefully, studying the date. Last Christmas, when everything had been different. Thomas stood between her and James. In the image, his arm around her waist, James slightly apart. Now it felt like a photograph from another life. "We don't have to put it up," James said quietly, reading her expression as he sorted through the box of decorations his mother had sent over. "No, it's part of our history," Rachel replied, hanging the ornament on their first Christmas tree together. "Besides, your mother would notice if it was missing. The McKinnon Somerset Christmas dinner would start in a few hours, and the pressure of hosting both families, including Thomas and his new girlfriend Susan from the farming cooperative, had been weighing on them for weeks. The farmhouse smelled of pine boughs and Martha's secret recipe sugar cookies, but underneath the holiday cheer ran a current of anxiety. "Susan seems nice," Rachel offered, adjusting a strand of lights. "From what your mother says, Mom says she's very organized, keeps spreadsheets for everything." James smiled slightly. Sounds like she and Thomas might actually be perfect for each other. Rachel laughed, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. More perfect than Thomas and I ever were, that's for sure. She stepped back to survey their work, though I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about having everyone here. First Christmas in our home. James pulled her into his arms and she relaxed against him, drawing strength from his steady presence. They're still our family, he reminded her. No matter how complicated things got, that hasn't changed. The sound of cars on the gravel drive made them both look up. Through the window they could see their parents arriving. The Somerset station wagon, followed by the McKinnon's truck. And behind them, Thomas's sleek new vehicle, Susan, visible in the passenger seat. "Here we go," Rachel murmured, straightening her holiday dress. James squeezed her hand, and together they went to greet their guests. The initial moments were a flutter of coats and gifts, exclamations over decorations, and the careful dance of families still learning new boundaries. Susan proved to be a tall, capable-looking woman who immediately offered to help in the kitchen, producing a tablet with what she called her optimized holiday dinner workflow. "Very efficient," Martha McKinnon said diplomatically, exchanging glances with Rachel's mother. The older women shooed everyone else out, claiming the kitchen as their domain. In the living room, James and his father discussed the winter wheat. While Rachel's father told Thomas about changes at the grain elevator, Susan sat nearby, making notes on her tablet. The conversation was polite, careful, but underneath ran currents of unspoken words and shifting loyalties. Then Rachel's young niece Katie broke the tension by announcing, "I want to hear the story about the wedding. Mom says it's better than a movie." A horrified silence fell. Susan's tablet stilled. Thomas's face went carefully blank, but before panic could set in, James's father started to laugh. "Well, she's not wrong about that," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Though I think what happened after is the better story. How these two have made something pretty special out of an unexpected situation." Thomas cleared his throat. "They have," he said quietly. All eyes turned to him. The wheat grade this harvest proved it. Sometimes he glanced at Susan, who smiled encouragingly. "Sometimes things work out the way they're supposed to, even if it's not the way we planned." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes, and James's hand found hers. The moment was broken by Martha calling everyone to dinner, but something had shifted, some last bit of ice finally thawing. The meal that followed was noisy, warm, and gradually more relaxed. Old stories mixed with new ones, laughter became more genuine, and if some moments still held echoes of past pain, they were softened by the glow of candles and the spirit of the season. Later, as they gathered around the tree to exchange gifts, Rachel caught sight of the family ornament again. In the evening light, the painted figures seemed to smile with new understanding. Sometimes, she realized, the best traditions weren't the ones you kept unchanged, but the ones you allowed to grow and adapt, like family itself. The emergency supply. It sat open on the kitchen counter, its contents spread out like evidence of their preparation. Batteries, flashlights, first aid supplies, and the radio that had been announcing increasingly urgent weather warnings all morning. James checked the items against his mental list while Rachel filled containers with water. "They're saying it could be the worst storm in 30 years, Rachel said, glancing out the window at the steely January sky. The temperature had dropped, 20 degrees since dawn, and the wind carried that peculiar howl that old-timers said preceded truly dangerous weather. "Dad's bringing the cattle into the south barn," James replied, adding extra matches to the kit. "Said the last time he saw clouds like this was the blizzard of '93. We lost power for 5 days. Rachel nodded, remembering the stories. "Mom always kept the old wood stove ready, just in case. I should call her. Make sure they're—" The lights flickered, then went out completely. In the sudden silence, the wind seemed even louder. "Well," James said calmly, reaching for a flashlight, "guess we're about to test our preparation." He clicked it on just as Rachel's phone buzzed. A final text from her mother before the cell towers went down. "We're fine. Stay put. Love you both." The first few hours weren't so bad. They moved through the familiar rooms by flashlight, gathering quilts and extra clothing, sharing stories of storms past. The wood stove that James had insisted on keeping despite Thomas's modernization plans proved its worth, keeping the kitchen and living room tolerably warm. But as darkness fell early, brought on by the thick clouds, the storm's true fury arrived. Wind screamed around the corners of the old farmhouse, and snow drove horizontally past the windows. The temperature inside began to drop despite the stove's efforts. "We need to check the animals," James said, already reaching for his heavy coat. Rachel grabbed his arm. "Together," she insisted. "You're not going out there alone." They bundled up in layers, looking like awkward astronauts by the time they were done. The beam of their flashlight barely penetrated the swirling snow as they made their way to the barn, holding onto each other and a guide rope James had strung. Earlier, the livestock greeted them with nervous sounds, sensing the storm's danger. Together, they checked water troughs, added extra feed, and ensured the emergency heaters were working on their backup power. As they worked, their movements fell into an easy rhythm. No words needed, just the understanding that had grown between them over months of shared labor. "Remember that first harvest night?" Rachel asked as they headed back toward the house, fighting the wind every step. "When we stayed out until 2 in the morning to beat the rain." "Seems like years ago," James replied, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "Though I knew even then." A particularly fierce gust nearly knocked them off their feet, cutting off his words. Finally back inside, they shed their frozen outer layers by the stove. Rachel's hands were shaking with cold, and James took them between his own, rubbing gently to restore circulation. The intimate gesture felt different in the storm's isolation, charged with meaning beyond simple warmth. "Knew what?" Rachel asked, looking up at him. "What did you know that harvest night?" James met her eyes in the flickering light of the stove. "Knew that I'd never been happier, despite being exhausted and worried about the weather. Because you were there, understanding. Exactly what needed doing without being told. Because we moved together like we'd been doing it all our lives." Rachel's cold fingers tightened around his. "I knew too," she whispered. "I just couldn't admit it then. But every time we worked together, every moment we shared, it felt like coming home." The wind howled outside, but in that moment it felt distant, unimportant. James pulled Rachel closer, and when their lips met, it was different from their previous kisses. Deeper, more certain, as if the storm's danger had stripped away their last hesitations. When they finally parted, Rachel smiled. "You know what else I remember about that harvest night? You promised me a dance when we finished, but we were too tired." James glanced at their battery-powered radio. "Well, we're not too tired now." He turned it on, finding a clear station playing old country songs. In the dim light of flashlights and wood fire, they swayed together, letting the music and the storm's wild symphony create their own private world. "I love you," James said simply, the words feeling as natural as breathing. "Not because of how things happened, but because of who we've become together." Rachel laid her head against his chest, hearing his steady heartbeat. "I love you too," she replied. "Maybe I always did. I just needed a storm to show me clear as day." They danced until the flashlight batteries began to dim, then huddled under quilts by the stove's warmth, talking softly of everything and nothing as the storm raged on. Outside, winter tried its best to overwhelm their sanctuary, but inside they had all they needed: warmth, security, and the deep certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Rachel's garden seeds lay sorted on the kitchen table in neat rows, each packet a promise of new beginnings. Her grandmother's planting journal lay open beside them, its pages filled with generations of wisdom about timing and placement, companion planting and soil preparation. The spring sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a benediction. On their plans, your grandmother was quite the scientist, James observed, reading over her shoulder. I never knew marigolds could protect tomatoes from pests. She called it common sense farming, Rachel replied, smiling at the familiar handwriting. Said chemicals were just shortcuts for people who didn't want to learn nature's way. She sorted through the seed packets, some saved from their own plants, others carefully selected from heritage seed catalogues. I thought we might expand the kitchen garden this year, maybe add that herb section you mentioned. James pulled out a chair, settling beside her with his morning coffee. I like that idea, though you know what Thomas would say about using valuable cropland for herbs. Thomas is doing quite well with his cooperative, Rachel said mildly. They'd run into him and Susan at the agricultural supply store last week. The encounter had been surprisingly comfortable, marked by genuine interest in each other's projects rather than the awkward tension of previous meetings. He is, James agreed. Susan mentioned they're expecting a baby in the fall, first grandchild for both sides. Mom's already planning the nursery at their house. Rachel touched the seed packets gently. Life moves forward, doesn't it? New seasons, new beginnings. She glanced at James. Speaking of which, Pastor Mitchell asked if we'd host the spring charity dinner this year. Said it's traditionally held at the oldest family farm, which is technically now ours, since we're working. Both properties. Are you ready for that? It would mean entertaining half the county. I think I am. Rachel stood, moving to the window where the first daffodils were pushing through the soil. You know, when everything first happened, the wedding, the switch. I used to worry every time we went to church, every time we showed up at community events. Kept waiting for the whispers, the judgment. But lately it feels normal, James finished. Like this is how it was always meant to be. She turned back to him, sunlight haloing her hair. Exactly. The other day, Betty Anderson actually asked my advice about her daughter's wedding. Said anyone who could turn a disaster into a blessing must know something about marriage. James laughed. Well, she's not wrong, though I wouldn't recommend our exact method to everyone. No, Rachel agreed, returning to the table and her seeds. But I would recommend marrying your best friend, someone who knows which tools you need before you ask for them. Someone who understands why you save seeds from your grandmother's tomatoes, even though you can buy perfectly good ones at the store. James reached across the table, taking her hand. Someone who knows that farming isn't just about profit margins and production quotas. It's about stewardship, legacy, and loving the land enough to listen to what it needs. They sat in comfortable silence, planning their garden, while spring sunshine warmed the kitchen. The seeds before them represented more than just summer vegetables. They were physical reminders of their shared vision, their commitment to balancing innovation with tradition. A knock at the screen door interrupted their planning. It was Susan, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. Sorry to interrupt, she said, stepping into the kitchen. But I wanted to ask... She paused, taking in the seed packets and planning journal. Am I interrupting something? Not at all, Rachel assured her. We're just planning the kitchen garden. Would you like some tea? I just made a fresh pot. Susan's shoulders relaxed. That would be nice, thank you. She settled at the table, her hands instinctively moving to her barely visible baby bump. Actually, this is perfect. I wanted to ask about traditional farming practices. Thomas is brilliant with modern methods, but... She gestured to her stomach. Something about becoming a mother makes you think about roots, about doing things the old way. Rachel and James exchanged glances, both remembering their own journey to valuing tradition alongside progress. Well, Rachel said, pulling out her grandmother's journal, you've come to the right place. Why don't we start with these companion planting charts? They're especially relevant for organic growing. The morning stretched into afternoon as they shared gardening wisdom and family stories. Susan proved to be an eager student, her tablet gradually forgotten as she made notes in an old-fashioned notebook instead. When she left, she carried seed packets Rachel had insisted she take, along with promises to return for planting lessons. "That felt good," Rachel said, watching Susan's car disappear down the drive, "like healing something we didn't even know was still wounded." James wrapped his arms around her from behind, both of them looking out at the fields where green shoots were just beginning to emerge. "Spring has a way of doing that," he said, "making all things new." The hospital bracelet felt foreign and harsh against Rachel's wrist as she sat in the emergency room waiting area, her hands shaking as she filled out forms. James had been conscious when they loaded him into the ambulance, but the amount of blood from the equipment accident had terrified her. The old combine's machinery had caught his arm while he was trying to repair it, and if she hadn't been nearby to hear his shout, "Mrs. McKinnon," a nurse appeared with another clipboard. "We need some information about your husband's medical history." Husband. The word still gave her pause sometimes, but not today. Today it felt like the most important word in the world, carrying all her fears and hopes and desperate prayers. "He's allergic to penicillin," she said automatically, remembering conversations over breakfast, casual mentions of medical facts that now seemed crucially important. "And he had his appendix out when he was 12. The emergency room doors swished open, and both sets of parents rushed in. Martha McKinnon immediately pulled Rachel into her arms while Joe disappeared to find a doctor. Rachel's mother took the clipboard, finishing the forms with steady hands, while Rachel finally allowed herself to shake apart a little. "He was fixing the combine," she explained into Martha's shoulder. "I told him to wait, that we should call the repair service, but he said he knew what was wrong with it." "Sounds like a McKinnon man," Martha said softly. "Stubborn as the day is long." She pulled back to look at Rachel's face. "But they're strong too. James is strong." Thomas arrived next, Susan close behind him. He looked pale but composed, immediately, taking charge of dealing with insurance paperwork and calling members of their farming community who would need to know. Rachel watched him work, remembering how she'd once admired his efficiency. Now she understood the difference between efficiency and love. Love was what had made her run toward James's shout instead of away from it, what had given her the strength to apply pressure to the wound while calling 911. What kept her heart beating despite feeling like it might shatter. The doctor finally emerged, still in surgical scrubs. "Mrs. McKinnon, your husband is stable. The machinery caught his arm at an angle that could have been much worse. He'll need physical therapy, and he'll be out of commission for several weeks, but there's no permanent damage." Rachel's knees went weak with relief. Susan quickly pushed a chair behind her, and she sank into it gratefully. "Can I see him?" "He's asking for you," the doctor smiled, "though he seems more worried about the spring planting than his own condition." "That's because he's an idiot," Rachel said, but her voice was full of love. "A wonderful, stubborn idiot who thinks he can fix everything himself." They let her in to see him, and the sight of James in the hospital bed, pale but alert, his arm heavily bandaged, nearly undid her composure again. He reached for her with his good hand. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "You were right about calling the repair service." Rachel took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "If you ever scare me like that again, I'll plant the entire north field in decorative sunflowers." He laughed, then winced. "You fight dirty, Mrs. McKinnon. I learned from the best." She perched carefully on the edge of his bed. "The whole family's here. Thomas is handling the paperwork." "Thomas is here." James's eyes widened slightly. "Of course he is. You're his brother." Rachel squeezed his hand. "You should have seen him take charge out there, though Susan had to remind him to breathe." "A couple times." James was quiet for a moment. "When it happened, when the machine caught me, I wasn't thinking about the farm or the planting or anything practical. I was thinking about you, about how many mornings I still wanted to wake up beside you, how many seasons I wanted to share." "James," Rachel's voice caught, "let me finish. I know our beginning wasn't traditional. I know some people probably still talk about how it all happened. But lying there, waiting for help, all I could think was that saying "I do" that day was the best decision I ever made. Not because it was practical or right for the farms, but because I love you. I love you in a way that makes everything else make sense. Rachel leaned forward, careful of his injury, and kissed him softly. I love you too. Enough to let you keep that ridiculous old combine, even after this, though we are getting it professionally serviced from now on. Yes, ma'am, he smiled. Doctor says I'll be laid up for a while. Good thing you married someone who knows how to run every piece of equipment on both farms, Rachel said. Even that ancient tractor you love so much. Good thing I married you, period. James's eyes were getting heavy with medication, but his grip on her hand remained strong. Stay? Always, Rachel promised, settling into the chair beside his bed. Outside the window, spring twilight was settling over their fields, where tomorrow's work waited. But for now, all that mattered was the steady beep of monitors and the warm certainty of his hand in hers. A love tested by crisis and found unshakable. Titi. New wedding rings lay nestled in their velvet box on the dresser, simple bands of rose gold that Rachel and James had chosen together. Unlike the elaborate platinum rings from the first ceremony, now tucked away in a drawer, these were burnished and sturdy, designed to withstand the daily work of farming life. Inside each band was engraved a single word, chosen. James stood at the mirror, carefully doing up his shirt buttons one-handed, his injured arm still in a sling, but healing well. Rachel watched from the doorway, already dressed in the simple, cream-colored dress they'd found in a small boutique in the city. Need help? She asked, though she already knew the answer. In the weeks since the accident, they'd developed a rhythm for dealing with his temporary limitations. Just with the tie, he admitted. She stepped forward, taking the blue silk from his good hand. They'd chosen the color together, the same shade as the morning glory flowers that climbed the farmhouse porch. Nervous? She asked, adjusting the knot with practiced fingers. Not like last time, he smiled, though I do wish we could have kept it smaller. Mum's invited half the county. That's because half the county insisted on coming, Rachel reminded him. Betty Anderson said, and I quote, "If you think we're missing the chance to see this story come full circle, you don't know this community very well." The afternoon sun slanted through their bedroom window, catching the new rings and sending sparkles dancing across the wall. They'd planned everything about this renewal ceremony themselves. No family pressure, no grand expectations, just the simple truth of their love and the desire to celebrate it properly. Thomas asked if he could say a few words during the ceremony. Rachel said carefully, smoothing James's collar, "I told him we'd have to ask you." James caught her hand, pressing it against his chest. "Of course he can. He's my brother, and after everything at the hospital..." He paused, remembering how Thomas had stayed, handling the practical details so they could focus on recovery. "We're family, all of us, in our own way." A knock at the door revealed Martha McKinnon and Anne Somerset, both already dabbing at their eyes. "The guests are arriving," Martha announced, "and the sunset's going to be perfect, just like we prayed for." They'd chosen to hold the ceremony in the field where the Somerset and McKinnon properties met, the same spot where they'd celebrated their harvest success. Now an arch of wildflowers marked the place, and rows of simple chairs waited for their guests. "You know," Anne said, helping Rachel with her small bouquet of fresh-cut flowers from their kitchen garden, "when you first told us about wanting to do this, I wondered if it might stir up old hurts. But seeing how you two have grown together, how you've made something so beautiful out of an unexpected situation," she wiped fresh tears, "well, let's just say some things are meant to be, even if they take a surprising path to get there." The women left to take their places, leaving Rachel and James alone for a moment. They stood together at the window, looking out over their land, no longer two separate farms, but truly one operation, managed with a blend of innovation and tradition that honored both families' legacies. "Ready to marry me again?" James asked, softly. Rachel turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. I think I've been ready since that first harvest night, even if I didn't know it then. But this time, she smiled, this time we're choosing it with our whole hearts, no doubts, no complications. No brother swapping, James added with a grin. No brother swapping, she agreed. Though I have to say, I'm glad the first time worked. Out the way it did. Sometimes the best love stories aren't the ones that follow the expected script. The sound of guitar music drifted up from the field, their cue to join their waiting guests. James offered her his good arm, and together they moved toward the door, toward their second beginning. I love you, he said simply, not because of circumstance or convenience or tradition, just because you're you, and we're us. And that's the best kind of love story I can imagine. Rachel squeezed his arm, her heart full. Let's go tell it to everyone then, she said. Our story, our way this time. The sunset photography session captured a moment that would become legend in their farming community. James and Rachel McKinnon, silhouetted against a sky painted in brilliant oranges and purples, standing in the field where their properties once met. But it wasn't just the spectacular sunset that made the image remarkable. It was the authenticity of their joy, the way they looked at each other as if they were the only two people in the world. The ceremony itself had been everything. Their first wedding wasn't. Intentional, intimate, and deeply personal. Pastor Mitchell had opened with words that made everyone smile. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today, again. But this time, I believe we've got the right brother. The laughter that rippled through the gathering set the tone for what followed. Gone was the tension of their first ceremony, replaced by the comfortable certainty of a love tested by time and circumstance. Even Thomas, standing now as a supportive brother rather than a reluctant groom, seemed at peace with his place in their story. I've been asked to say a few words, Thomas began when his moment came, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Which is ironic, considering my words at the first ceremony were rather brief. He paused as another wave of gentle laughter passed through the gathering. But today, I want to speak about right places and right times. He turned to face James and Rachel directly. Sometimes the right thing happens in what seems like the wrong way. A year ago, I thought I knew exactly what our futures should look like, all laid out in spreadsheets and business plans. But watching you two together, seeing how you've balanced tradition with progress, family loyalty with personal truth, well, you've taught me that the best plans are sometimes the ones we never made. Susan, her pregnancy now clearly visible, squeezed his hand as he continued. James, you've always been the keeper of our family's heart. And Rachel, you saw that heart when the rest of us were too busy looking at ledgers. Together, you've created something more valuable than any merger could have achieved. A partnership of equals, built on understanding and genuine love. When it came time for their own vows, James and Rachel chose to speak from the heart rather than from prepared texts. James went first, his injured arm a reminder of how precious their time together was. Rachel, he said, his voice steady and, sure, a year ago I made you promises in this same field. Today I make them again, not because I have to, but because I choose to, every day, every season, every moment. I promise to be your partner in all things, to honor both our traditions and our dreams, to love you not just wisely, but well. Rachel's response came with equal certainty. James, you've taught me that the greatest love isn't the one that looks perfect on paper, but the one that feels like coming home. I promise to be your equal in work and in joy, to face whatever weather comes our way together, and to choose you again and again through every harvest and every spring planting to come. The exchange of new rings drew happy tears from both mothers, and even Joe McKinnon was seen to brush suspiciously at his eyes. The simple bands caught the last rays of sunset as they slipped them on each other's fingers, the word chosen now a secret between them. After Pastor Mitchell pronounced them still husband and wife, the celebration began in earnest. Tables laden with potluck dishes stretched across the field. Fairy lights twinkled in mason jars, and someone started up the old record player they'd brought outside, filling the evening air with classic country songs. The community that had once whispered about scandal now raised their glasses in genuine celebration. Betty Anderson was overheard telling anyone who would listen that she'd known all along they were meant for each other, while the younger folks started a friendly betting pool on whether Thomas and Susan's baby would be a farmer or a business consultant. As twilight deepened into night, James and Rachel shared their first dance, properly this time, with no storms or uncertainties to disturb them. The photographer captured that moment too, their foreheads touching, matching smiles on their faces. Two people who had found their way to the right love by an unexpected path. "Happy?" James whispered as they swayed together. "Perfect," Rachel replied, and meant it with all her heart. The anniversary quilt spread across their bed told their story in fabric and thread, a wedding gift that had arrived mysteriously the week after their vow renewal. Each square contributed by a different community member. It captured their journey in textile form. The old Methodist church, the family tractor, intertwined wheat sheaves, a combine silhouetted against a harvest moon. The central panel, crafted by both grandmothers working together, showed their two farmhouses joined by a road of golden stitches. Betty Anderson finally admitted she organized it, Rachel told James as they got ready for their anniversary dinner. "Said every love story needs a proper quilt to wrap itself in." James smiled, adjusting his tie, the same blue silk from their second ceremony. His arm had healed completely, though he was more careful now around the machinery, more willing to ask for help when needed. The whole town must have kept that secret for months. "Same way they kept quiet about this dinner tonight," Rachel replied, pinning up her hair, "though I suspect your mother's behind this one." They'd received a formal invitation the week before, requesting their presence at the community center for what was described as a celebration of unconventional wisdom. The dress code specified farming formal, which Rachel had decided meant her best dress and James's good suit, the one without any grain dust in the pockets. The late summer evening was perfect for driving with the windows down, the air heavy with the scent of ripening wheat. They passed Thomas and Susan's place, where lights blazed welcome, and their 2-month-old daughter could sometimes be heard practicing her impressively healthy lungs. The baby had her father's determination and her mother's precision. She cried exactly on schedule and refused to be soothed by anyone except her Uncle James. "Remember this road a year ago?" James asked as they turned toward town. "That mad dash from the church, neither of us sure what we'd just done?" Rachel reached for his hand. "I remember being terrified and exhilarated all at once, and thinking that somehow, despite everything, it felt right." "It was right," James said simply. "Just took everyone else a while to see it." The community center parking lot was full when they arrived, and through the windows they could see tables decorated with wildflowers and mason jar candles. Martha McKinnon met them at the door, suspiciously misty-eyed already. "Now, don't make a fuss," she said, hugging them both. "We just thought some things deserve proper celebrating." Inside, it seemed the entire farming community had turned out. The walls were decorated with photographs documenting their year together. James and Rachel at harvest time, covered in dust but grinning, the two of them teaching Thomas and Susan's daughter to drive the parked tractor, their second wedding ceremony at sunset. A particularly touching image showed both sets of parents working together to restore the old McKinnon barn, their easy camaraderie evident even in stillness. Betty Anderson, clearly in her element as master of ceremonies, called for attention. "A year ago," she began, "we all witnessed something extraordinary. Some called it scandal, some called it fate, but I call it a reminder that love doesn't always follow the expected path." She gestured to where Thomas and Susan sat with their baby. "Sometimes the wrong turn leads to the right destination. Sometimes what looks like an ending becomes a beginning, and sometimes," she smiled at James and Rachel, "sometimes it takes A whole community to recognize that what God has joined together, He joined for good reason. The evening unfolded like a celebration of not just their marriage, but the community itself. The potluck dinner featured everyone's signature dishes, from Martha's chicken and dumplings to Joe McKinnon's secret recipe barbecue. Stories were shared, some embarrassing, most heartwarming, all part of their collective history now. "You've changed things," Reverend Mitchell told them quietly during the dessert course. "Not just for yourselves, but for all of us. You've shown that tradition and change can coexist, that love can surprise us, that grace can be found in unexpected moments." Later, as James led Rachel onto the dance floor, she noticed something remarkable. "Look," she whispered, nodding toward the corner where Thomas was teaching Susan to two-step, their baby sleeping peacefully in Martha's arms. "A year ago, who would have thought we'd all be here like this?" "Life has a way of sorting itself out," James replied, pulling her closer, "as long as you're brave enough to follow your heart." They danced beneath strings of fairy lights, surrounded by the people who had witnessed their unconventional beginning and helped shape their continuing story. The anniversary quilt would go home with them, a tangible reminder of community acceptance and support. But the real gift was this: the knowledge that love, when true and steady, could transform not just two people, but an entire community's understanding of what meant to be really meant. The family portrait hanging in the McKinnon farmhouse kitchen captured 3 generations in a single frame. James and Rachel seated on the porch swing, their 2-year-old daughter Emma perched between them, all 3 sets of grandparents arranged around them. The photo had been taken on Emma's baptism day, the same day they'd announced they were expecting their second child. What the portrait couldn't show was how the farms had flourished under their shared stewardship. The Somerset McKinnon Agricultural Partnership had become a model for sustainable farming in the region, proving that traditional wisdom and modern methods could work in harmony. Thomas's cooperative often consulted with them now, bringing groups of young farmers to learn about their balanced approach. Emma, with her father's quiet strength and her mother's determination, was already showing signs of being a natural farmer. She rode in the combine with Rachel during harvest, solemnly explaining to her dolls about crop rotation. James had started a journal for her, recording the rhythms of farm life just as his father had done for him. The old Methodist church still stood proud against the prairie sky, its doors open every Sunday to a community that had learned valuable lessons about love and judgment, tradition and change. And if anyone asked about the unusual circumstances that had brought James and Rachel together, they would simply smile and say that sometimes the best harvests grow from unexpected plantings.